Hello, Secretary Shultz. We are the junior and senior class of Mount Madonna, and we're really, really grateful that you've taken the time to talk to us today. We've prepared some questions for you, but if you have any opening statements, we'd love to hear them as well.
Well, you probably would rather ask me questions. Or would you like me to say something? Whatever you want.
Yeah, well, it'd be good to hear what's up for you today, George.
Well, I'm undertaking a new book I've written. I've been surprised in looking to see how much I've written over the years. And I thought I would put together a book starting very early up to the present, pick out things, and see if I could have some evidence that I learned something as I went along. And it's kind of interesting to read what I wrote 60 years ago about something. I've got some stuff when I was about your age that I wrote somehow or other. I said, how did I happen to do that? But it's made me think about my life and what I've learned and why and how I went about learning. And I'm in my 90s now, and people say I'm reasonably alert. And why is that? I think it's because somehow early in my life I learned how much fun it is to learn something. And it's often said that experience is the best teacher. But the fact of the matter is that you can take a group of people like this and expose them to the same experience, and some people will learn something from it, and some people don't learn anything from it. So the question is, how do you learn how to learn from experience and what you gathered? So I was fortunate. I had a very loving mother and father who, as I look back on it, exposed me to things where I had to make decisions and then live with the consequences. And they encouraged me to play sports. And so the principle of accountability is a very important one to get into yourself, I think. There are consequences to what you do. For example, I'm doing some, but I have this on my mind because I've been putting together papers I wrote. When I was a professor at the University of Chicago, I watched during the administrations of Presidents Kennedy and Johnson frequent intervention in labor disputes on the grounds that if they happened, it would constitute a national emergency, and therefore they had to intervene to do something about it. And I wrote that that was a mistake. Too much would wind up robbing the system in which labor and management are supposed to settle their disputes for themselves, undermining their sense of accountability and responsibility, and would change the system in an undesirable way. So along about August or so, 1968, there was a strike of the longshoremen on the east and Gulf coasts. And President Johnson, using provisions of the Taft-Hartley law, declared that if the strike took place, it would constitute a national emergency. So he enjoined the strike. And built into the law is a provision for a so-called fast-track appeal to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court agreed with the president that it would constitute a national emergency. Well, the injunction period ran out in mid-January or so of 1969, and I was sworn in as Secretary of Labor on January 21st. So the press people said, okay, Professor Shultz, now you're Secretary of Labor, what are you going to do? So I was cheeky, and I went to the president, who was preoccupied with other things. I said, Mr. President, I explained the strategy, and I said, your predecessor was wrong and the Supreme Court was wrong. This dispute will cause a lot of kerfuffle, particularly around New York City, and New York thinks that's a national emergency, but it isn't. You'd be surprised at the way the economy adjusts. And the things that cause people unease are just the pressures will enable us to mediate this dispute and get it settled. So he went along with me, and the strike went on. It became clear to the parties the White House wasn't going to come in and tell them what to do. And I had some good mediation, and we got it settled. And there was no national emergency. So I learned something. It's important when you get into the world of action to bring some ideas. And that there is a bias in the governmental structure toward intervention. I suppose because people are afraid that if they have the right to intervene and they don't, and something bad happens, they'll get blamed. So it tilts it in that direction. But when it tilts it in that direction, you get away from the basic notion of accountability, and you undermine the system. So this is just an example. So I'm going through old stuff and looking at things that I did and what did I learn from them. And I think that with all due respect to your school and the substantive things you're learning, 2 and 2 makes 22 and stuff like that, the most important thing you're learning is how to learn and the fun of learning. And if you get to be in your 90s like me and somebody asks you, how did you manage that? It's because you kept learning. If a day goes by and I didn't learn anything, I think it's a wasted day. So that's enough. So are you asking the questions or is somebody else going to?
I have the first one.
You have the first one. Then we go around this room? Holy cow, you got a lot of questions. Go ahead.
So in Turmoil and Triumph, Senator Kennedy said that you seemed to be a man who was beyond ambition. And he went on to say that it's rare in Washington, D.C. And then in the Mount Madonna interview in 2010, you were quoted saying, "You can't want your job too much. If you want the job too much, then you'll find yourself agreeing with things that you don't agree with." So given your neutrality when it comes to ambition, we're curious kind of what propelled you into such important positions throughout your life?
I wouldn't say I'm without ambition. I think, at least I've always felt, whatever job you have, it's important to try to do it as well as you possibly can. And if you take the job of Secretary of State, I don't think people realize what a hard job it is. That is, you're intellectually tested and stressed all the time because you're grappling with a huge variety of things, some of which you know quite a lot about, some of which you don't know much about, so you got to find out about them. So I think keeping learning is, as I said, is the big thing, and so I think to be ambitious is to try to do a good job on whatever you're doing. I didn't say I want to be Secretary of State. It just happened. And often I was offered a lot of jobs that I didn't take. But then one comes along and you just, maybe you sit down and you do an analysis of pros and cons, but your immediate reaction is probably the right one, that, yeah, this is going to be a good job for me. Then, of course, if you're offered one of these big jobs in the government, at least in my way of thinking, you have to have awful good reasons not to take it, because public service is a great privilege. It's also a great opportunity because you can accomplish things if things go right beyond anything you could accomplish as a private individual. So you can make a contribution.
My name is Bryson Smith, Secretary Shultz, and when we were formulating the previous question, we got into a discussion about ambition and what aspects of it are positive and negative, and we were curious if you had any opinions or thoughts that you've developed in your career about ambition and how it can help you, how it can hurt you, that kind of thing?
I never really thought much about ambition as such. As I said, I did things I was interested in. If you said to yourself, work is defined as doing something that you don't really like very much, but you do it anyway because you need to make a living, I've never worked in my life. And I think that if I had a job that I didn't like and I thought it wasn't interesting, I'd find another job. I suppose you can look at people who seem to be very ambitious for something, and maybe the negative side is you can get carried away and do things that you know aren't quite right, cutting corners in order to seem to accomplish something. But if you do that, you know it's not right. And if you're honest with yourself, you know that even if you got to the goal, you really didn't. So I think there's got to be a sense of right and wrong somehow, and I don't mean in a rigid sense, but that's got to be along with your ambition to get something or other done.
Thank you.
Secretary Shultz, my name is Quincy Mitchell, and my question is, we watched the nuclear tipping point recently in class, and in situations like
Where
nuclear
do you get all
disarmament,
this stuff? You watch Turmoil and Triumph and Nuclear Tipping Point? What else did you do?
yeah, we watched both of them. So in situations like nuclear disarmament, nations or individuals, they seem to have a choice between something that's better for the world community with some perceived risk to themselves, or something that maximizes their own perceived self-interest at much greater potential risk to everyone else. What force or reasoning do you think can convince each party to make the globally optimal choices and overcome the fear risk of losing advantage of their individual country?
Well, if you think about it carefully, for me, it's an open and shut case that we would all be better off without nuclear weapons. It may be that some country feels it's an equalizer, but if it turns out they get involved in a nuclear exchange of some kind, there's nothing left of them. So what have you achieved by having yourself destroyed in a nuclear exchange? I think that realization was behind the statement that President Reagan and then General Secretary Gorbachev made in Geneva before the Reykjavik summit, the first meeting they had between them. They agreed that a nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought. It can't be won because you wipe each other out. So early in his presidency, President Reagan asked the Joint Chiefs of Staff to tell him what the effect would be on the United States of an all-out Soviet nuclear attack on us. And they took their time and they came back after carefully thinking about it. And they said the initial casualties would be on the order of 150 million people. And there would be cascading casualties after that because we would have no infrastructure and all radioactivity and so on. Or would he retaliate? Yes. What would happen in the Soviet Union? Sort of the same thing. So that's what led him to say all the time, what's so good about a system of keeping the peace by an ability to wipe each other out? So I think people have to grapple with the implications of a nuclear weapon. You probably have seen, if you watched that nuclear tipping point, you saw pictures of Hiroshima. That bomb is very small in comparison with the hydrogen bombs now that we and others have. They'd incinerate the greater New York area like that, one bomb. It's been interesting to me that religious leaders have come here, evangelicals, for instance, asked if they could come, if we'd meet with them and tell them our views on nuclear-free world. So they gathered, we sent them material, they gathered in this room, group about the size of this. And I was impressed they had read the material that we sent. We had very good discussions. And one of them said about halfway through, this is a life issue. And how is it that an individual human being should have the ability to press a button and kill 1 million people? Who do you think you are? So I think these weapons have a destructive capacity that's beyond a human dimension. Henry Kissinger is a great phraseologist. He's had a couple of phrases that I like. One, he said, "We have stolen fire from the gods. Let us hope we can contain it before it consumes us." And he also said that if a nuclear weapon goes off somewhere, there will be a demand all over the world that governments do something about that. If they can't, what's the good of government? And so some of us are saying, why don't we do it before a bomb goes off rather than wait until afterwards? So I know some people will think it's to their advantage. Now, the thing that is most worrisome are exchanges that can erupt spontaneously and sort of get out of control, or the acquisition by a terrorist group of a weapon. The terrorist group isn't deterrable. That is, there's no return address for deterrence, and their object is to be destructive. So one of the things we worry about is getting control of fissile material, which they can make a bomb out of. And then you worry about nuclear exchange. For example, we assembled in this room about 5 months or so ago a group of Indian and Pakistani recently retired foreign ministers, generals, people like that, who still had access to their governments. And as you know, there's lots of tension between India and Pakistan, long-standing. Both countries have nuclear weapons. And Pakistan realizes that India's conventional armed forces are much stronger than Pakistan's. So that's how they justify a nuclear weapon. And we met, and it was, we managed to get them, they signed up to a bunch of confidence building measures in the nuclear area, which they all signed, and they presented to their governments and seemed to do a little good. I don't know how much. But on the side, I'm talking to one of the Pakistani generals. I said, what are you most worried about? He said, I'm most worried about a nuclear war. Why? He says, because we have a lot of groups, people in our country whose life is struggle against India. And somebody can get loose and create another Mumbai. You all remember Mumbai? Obviously that came from Pakistan, although it wasn't the Pakistan government as such, but it was some group in Pakistan. And India's response was very restrained to that. So what I'm worried about is somebody goes and creates another Mumbai, and the Indians, as almost a political matter, can't just sit there. And their armed forces come, and it turns out Pakistan is no match for them, and somebody sets off a nuclear weapon. And then we have a nuclear exchange. That's my worry. And I think it's a legitimate worry. And somehow, if we're going to be successful in the effort to get rid of nuclear weapons, we have to come to grips with things like the tensions between India and Pakistan and see if something can't be done to damp them down. One thing that we did in this same meeting and later in a different one with just Pakistanis was to highlight for them and try to quantify for them how much their gross domestic product could rise if they didn't have all these tensions that tend to reduce economic activity. So the income of their people, their income per capita, is substantially lower than it could be because of these tensions. So if you do something about the tensions, people will have better lives. And so you work at these things.
Secretary Shultz, I'm Karina Fox. In the Mount Madonna interview of 2008, you said, obviously when both sides have weapons that can be devastating if used, it gets your attention. How can we keep people paying attention in order to continue the support for the process of nuclear arms reduction?
Well, work goes on. We and others, there's an organization called the Nuclear Threat Initiative that Senator Sam Nunn runs, and they're the ones who produced the nuclear tipping point film. We all took part in it, but they produced it. And we try to say to ourselves, well, we're not in government, so we can't decide things. What can we do? Well, we can examine ideas and put them forward, as we did, and then publish articles. The articles have had a global impact, it turns out. So that then you can get people stirred up. If the evangelicals are stirred up, as they seem to be, and they preach, it reaches people. Then one of the steps that we have advocated, and which is obvious, is getting better control of fissile material. If somebody gets a hold of some enriched uranium, weapons-grade enriched uranium, as Bill Perry puts it, it's not easy to make a nuclear weapon. It's not a piece of cake, but it's very doable. Bright MIT students can do it. Maybe Stanford students even. But anyway, it's doable. And so getting control of the fissile material is very important. So I'm happy to see that President Obama convened about 2 years ago in Washington a meeting of 47 heads of government to discuss the question of fissile material. Where is it? Let's really get track of it all, and let's get it secure. And there has just been completed in Seoul, South Korea, a follow-up conference to further push those things. So those are the kind of things that can be done. And obviously, in the end, it's governments that need to make the treaties or do the things we can't do. But as private citizens and as people at a university, we can think and we can write and we can develop ideas. It's also true that when you have a group of people gather who are talented people and they prepare papers and so on and have a conference, that in addition to the ideas, you have identified people. And the kind of people you're talking about, they're all basically patriotic, and if the government says, come and spend a week and give us the benefit of your expertise, they'll do it. And you identify them in the process. So we keep working on it. Never give up.
Secretary Shultz, my name is Amy Hopkins. Your job as Secretary of State appeared to be a lot about finding resolutions for many different conflicts. This must require an enormous amount of patience. Were there ever points in your career where that patience was stretched to the breaking point?
I mean, where I said, the hell with it? No. But I think to go back to your original question, you can't want the job too much. You have to say, if there's something deeply wrong, you have to say, no. For me, that's a breaker. I'll leave. I'll give you an example. people worry about leaks all the time. It drives them crazy, particularly people in the CIA and Defense Department. So they had a proposal that we should manage all high-level people through the use of lie detector tests. Everybody is given lie detector tests all the time. I called it management by fear. And they wanted to do it, and I opposed it, and we had arguments. And I went off on a fairly lengthy trip. And while I was away, the people that wanted it went to the president, and they made their case, and they persuaded him to sign something saying this should happen. And that became known. It was sort of known that I opposed it. So while I was on the trip, reporters asked me about it, and I said, that's a domestic matter. I'm not going to discuss it while I'm traveling. Brushed it off. So when I got back, I had appointed really a terrific group of people to give advice on South Africa and apartheid and how we should position ourselves and so on. I took them down to the press room and introduced them. And the first question was from one of the reporters that had been on the trip. He said, well, now you're back home. What about it? Will you take a lie detector test? And I said, yes, I'll take it once. Then I'm out of here. Because if you want me to make me take a lie detector test, you're saying you don't trust me. And if you don't trust me, I don't belong here. And that went out, and it caused a tremendous thing. And President Reagan invited me over to the Oval Office, and I said, well, Mr. President, he has a sign in his office, big glass thing like this that says, there's no limit to what a man or a woman can accomplish if you don't care who gets the credit. So that's the spirit, the way you administer. You administer by trust and encouragement, not by fear. This is wrong management. And I had, in effect, submitted my resignation when I said, I'll take a lie detector test once and then I'm out of here. And so he decided that I was right, and he rescinded the order, so I didn't have to leave. But I was in, as you can imagine, I was in very bad odor in the CIA, and they didn't like it. But nevertheless, I think you have to draw a line on where your own standards are and stick up for them. I resigned as Secretary of the Treasury because I didn't agree with the President's decision to reimpose wage and price controls, which I was in the process of unraveling. So you've got to draw a line.
Secretary Shultz, my name is Jake Getz, and you just spoke to the difficulties of negotiating through issues with leaders from your own government. And I was wondering, how did the difficulty of negotiating through issues with leaders of foreign governments compare to negotiating through issues with leaders from your own government?
Well, I published a book not long ago, maybe you saw it, Ideas in Action, 10 Commandments for Success in Negotiations. And the first commandment has to do with constituencies. So if you're negotiating, you're doing it on behalf of the U.S. government, or you're negotiating on behalf of a constituency. You want to be sure that you have your constituency behind you, so that when you make a decision or make a deal, the deal will stick. So you've got to see to it that people are behind you and they understand the issues. Negotiation is in some ways an educational process, because it's a way of exploring where the interests are of the other side and how strongly they feel. And to some extent, it's a way of educating your own people. And some people think you can get everything you want and that's it. And negotiation it shows them that that's probably not true. Even if you could get it, it wouldn't stick if it's all one-sided. So you have to work on your constituencies. But also you need to examine the other side and see if the person you're negotiating with can deliver on his or her constituency. And if they can't, that's not a person to make concessions to, because you're going to make concessions and the deal will not stick. So you're constantly looking at the other guy and wondering what his relationship is with his constituent. For instance, my opposite number in the Soviet negotiations was a man named Edward Shevardnadze. And Gorbachev was his constituency, in effect. He was the boss. So it was relatively new, and I'm negotiating with it, but I'm asking myself, what's the relationship between him and his boss, Gorbachev? And we had a summit meeting between the Reagan-Gorbachev first summit meeting in Geneva. And the first night, there was a dinner hosted by the Soviets at their place. And Gorbachev had the idea that the Soviets, the Russians, drank too much vodka. He was right about that, but anyway, that's what he thought. And he made it very hard to get vodka. That was one of the things that he did. So, to my surprise, we get sitting around the table, about 12 of us, and they came and they passed this big thing of caviar, and you help yourself, and then some guy comes around, pours vodka into shot glasses. And Shevardnadze gets up, and he looks at President Reagan, and he says, "Mr. President, here's to you. I had to come all the way to Geneva to get vodka." And with that, he downed it. And everybody laughed, and I said, he's got a good relationship with his boss, or he wouldn't get away with anything like that. On that subject, I had a long meeting with Gromyko. He was the foreign minister before Shevardnadze. And this was early in the Gorbachev time. And there was a dinner after the meetings, and we were sitting next to each other, and he started telling me about how Gorbachev was making it hard for people to get vodka. And I listened for a while, and then I said, you better be careful with that, because we tried that in our country, and it didn't work very well, prohibition. And I said, you also have to worry about street humor. He said, what do you mean, street humor? I mean, stories that go around on the streets, and what do you mean by that? I said, well, for instance, I said, there's a story going around about how these two guys are standing in line at the vodka store. An hour goes by, an hour and a half goes by, they're moving up in the line. Finally, one of them says, I'm sick of this. I'm going over to the Kremlin and shoot Gorbachev, and he leaves. But a half an hour later, he comes back, and his buddy's moved up in the line. His buddy looks at him and says, well, did you shoot him? He said, hell no, the line up there is a lot longer than this one. So it's that street humor.
Secretary Shultz, my name is Pollock Battengar. It must have been challenging when you had to respond when the Iran-Contra scandal was exposed. How did you manage in those difficult times?
That was a hard period because I had opposed the Iran arms sales. I thought it was a dumb thing, that it wasn't going to accomplish the purposes that were advertised. And it was really sold to President Reagan on the basis that we'd get hostages back. So you were trading arms for hostages, which was a very bad policy, because all that does is it teaches the other side that hostages are valuable, so they'll take more. So it's a bad policy, and I had opposed it all the time. And I'd also told people, this is going to leak out at some point, and so it did. And then I had a running battle to get it to stop, because even after it leaked, there were people who wanted to keep going. And it was a very tense time. And people said, well, I wasn't being loyal to the president because I wasn't supporting this program. I said, I'm the only one who is loyal to the president, because what you're doing will destroy him if you persist on this. And there was a period of, 2 or 3 weeks that was very tense. And it was generally known that what my attitude was. So the Congress didn't want to come have me testify because they knew I'd say what I thought and that would be the end. They didn't want me to cease. And always you're invited on the Sunday talk shows, the Sunday talk shows, Meet the Press, and so on. And I did them in sequence, to be fair, not one all the time. And the one coming up was CBS. And they kept asking me. And I didn't want to go on as long as the arms sales were continuing. And finally I got word from the President's Chief of Staff, Don Regan, that he had decided that no more arms sales. So I went on the CBS program. And a woman named Leslie Stahl was the interviewer. She interviews on 60 Minutes now. She's a very good interviewer, tough but fair. Anyway, so I'm all set to go on this interview, and I get a call in the morning about an hour or so before the interview that, no, I had the wrong information. I couldn't say that arms sales had stopped. But I'm committed to go to the interview, so I go to the interview. And some people said, well, she's a tough interviewer. She's perfectly, that's what they're supposed to do, is ask you searching questions. So and then she says something or other, and would you advocate selling arms to Iran? And I said, well, under the circumstances of Iran's support for terrorism and this and this and this, no. Then she said, are you speaking for the administration? And I said, no. That was the end of the interview. So the next day I had a speech to give out in Chicago, and I left in the morning and I told my staff, when I get back, I won't be Secretary of State anymore. But what happened is the White House blinked, and they announced that I did speak for the administration and there were no more arms sales. So that was, but that was a tough period.
Secretary Shultz. My name is Brooke Staveland, and my question is, the historian Barbara Tuchman made the statement to Bill Moyers that without a positive vision, people perish. In your speech at Stanford for Harry's last lecture series, you talk about the power of a positive vision, or the power of the ought. Besides nuclear arms reduction, what do you believe would be a worthy ought for America to unite behind?
Boy, you people do a lot of research. And you look at what I said the last time, I have to be very careful. They get quoted back to me. Well, I think that the ought has a lot of power if you keep after it. And a man named Max Kampelman is the one who put it vividly. Actually, in this room where we were talking, initial first conference we had on that led to the nuclear-free world thing. And Max said, we had the Declaration of Independence. It said all men were created equal. In 1776, are you kidding? We had slaves. Women couldn't vote. Only men that owned property could vote. Obviously, people were not being treated equal. But that was the ought. And over a period of time, sometimes with a lot of pain and agony, as in the Civil War, gradually in our country we've gotten closer and closer, having the is closer to the ought. And so he argued the ought is very powerful. Don't underrate it. Well, right now, of course, in that talk that you focused on, I was talking about the ought being we ought to get rid of nuclear weapons, and we got to keep that out there. But you want other oughts. Well, there are lots of them. I think right now in our country, we are out of control in our spending. And it just can't go on with these deficits that we're running. Think of it, it's just a matter of arithmetic. First of all, if you insist on consuming more than you produce, you have to import, right? It's just arithmetic. So we somehow blame China for having a big export surplus, and we have an import. It's China's fault. It's China's fault. It's our fault. We're consuming more than we produce. If you don't save any money to finance your own investment, and you're going to invest, where do you get it? You borrow it. So where are we borrowing from? Well, we borrowed a lot from Japan. We're borrowing a lot from China and others. And that is a legitimate claim on their part for our piece of our future. It's not desirable. Then you have the staggering size of the debt and the deficits. And they're being financed with very short-term debt obligations. And the Federal Reserve is keeping the interest rate on those obligations very, very low, less than 1%. That is masking the burden of that debt, because it's very short term. In other words, you have to keep rolling it over all the time. And there's new debt being added. Instead of an interest rate of 0.5%, it's inevitable, the way things are going, that interest rates go back up where they normally might be, like 3 or 4%. So you're going to quintuple the burden of the debt. It's going to make Medicare look like child's play. It's going to be such a burden. So we're building problems for the future by the excesses that we're engaging in right now, and I think it's very bad policy. And I've said so on many occasions, and others here have argued that point. And so I think that's something that we ought to do something about. And it comes down to us as individuals, as an individual or a family. You know very well you can't spend more than you earn forever. The nation is different, but not that different. So we've just got to make that point politically, I guess, make it somehow or other. I don't even consider it a partisan observation. I think the Republicans have been as bad as the Democrats, maybe not quite as bad, but anyway, in spending too much. So that's my ought. I got a lot of others, but that's enough.
Thank you.
Secretary Shultz, my name is Taylor Krulanovich. Do you think that it's necessary for some aspects of our government to evolve in response to the changing conditions of modern America? If so,
Our conditions of our government. Say that again, please.
that some aspects of our government need to evolve in response for the changing conditions of modern America? If so, what changes do you think need to be made?
I think our government is not being operated well right now, and change could make it much more effective in whatever it tries to do. It's almost like a constitutional crisis. On the Congress side, in our Constitution, the Congress has the power of the purse. The executive can't spend any money that the Congress doesn't appropriate. So therefore, it's up to the Congress to exercise that responsibly. And the way you exercise it responsibly is you hold hearings about what different parts of the government want to spend and set priorities and so on. The Congress hasn't produced a budget. It's mostly the Senate's fault in 3 years. So what happens is we go on what's called a continuing resolution. That is, you just keep going next year the same way as last year. But as your question suggests, the world is changing. So you don't necessarily want your priorities need to shift in response to that, but with this system, that's not happening. Then in the executive branch, more and more there is a tendency to appoint czars in the White House, people in the White House who are going to look after this, that, or the other subject. And policy tends to revolve around those people. Those people are not confirmed by the Senate, and they can't be called to testify. They claim executive privilege. The constitutional way of doing it is you get nominated to be secretary of something or other. You stand for confirmation. The Senate examines you and votes, and you get confirmed, so you're in the job. They can call you to testify anytime, so you're accountable. That's the right way to do it. Furthermore, if you rely on the cabinet to help the president decide things and make policy, well, the cabinet people don't get into those jobs if they aren't reasonably substantial people. And furthermore, the cabinet people have access to the expertise that's there in the people who are working for the government all the time. And they know a lot. And I had the experience of running 4 different departments. And I made a point of using the permanent people, and they respond, they love it. That's what they're there for, to be. And they'll work morning, noon, and night for you if you take them seriously and work at it, and they have a lot to offer. So if everything is the White House, you don't connect to them, so you miss that. So I think the right way to do it, and I wrote this, you may have seen something I wrote, is to identify the subjects that are key subjects you're going to work on. You're going to work on economics, you're going to work on justice, you're going to work on foreign policy and national security, you're going to work on natural resources, you're going to work on human resources, and maybe a couple of other things. And say, well, who are the cabinet departments that have something to say about that? And probably more than one on most of those topics. So now, at the same time, the Senate doesn't do its job either. Because if I'm going to have these constitutional officers who get nominated and confirmed, then the Senate has to act on the president's nominees. So there's now this lengthy process of endless forms you fill out. And I might say if there's any major error in the forms, it's a criminal penalty. So that then finally the president nominates you. The Senate has some additional things they want you to fill out. Then they take their time, whether they're going to give you a hearing or not. You may wait around for a month or two. And then you have a hearing, and suppose you're voted out of the committee that hears your favorably. Any senator can put a hold on your nomination, and they do. Say, I'm putting a hold on your nomination. Has nothing to do with you at all, just because I want to get something out of you, and I'm not going to get you through until I get this. That's completely wrong. So the whole process right now, I think, is not a good process, and it could be changed easily and made much better. That is, stop appointing all these people in the White House, make the confirmation process more sensible. I don't think people need to fill out these endless forms. Most people are honorable people, and they want to serve honorably. And you can do a quick IRS, FBI check on people, and also tell them, look, you don't want to take this job if you have a lot of skeletons in your closet, because they'll find out. You'd be better off to stay away.
Thank you.
Hi, Secretary. My name's Aaron Storrs, and my question to you is, you said that you always start with ideas. If you don't, you get lost. You also said in your Stanford speech, ideas are a compass. Is there a central idea that you started with and has remained with you as a compass throughout your career?
I suppose the central idea is to be honest with yourself and try to do things that are right.
Secretary Shultz, my name is Ariana Halton, and I was wondering if you could talk about your experiences as a Marine and how that affected your career and your life.
Well, I'm a Marine. I'm still a Marine. Marines never stop being Marines, no matter what. I'm just not on active duty, that's all. But you learn a lot in the Marine Corps. I'll mention two things. When I was in boot camp, when you enlist in the Marine Corps, you think you've enlisted in the Marine Corps, but you haven't. You become a boot. And it's only if you survive boot camp that you become a Marine. So you get kicked around and people learn if you can take it. And there's discipline. And the drill sergeant says, "Don't sit down until I say sit down." Sit down! Yes, sit down. But I remember the day he handed me my rifle. He said, "Take good care of this. This is your best friend. And remember one thing, never point this rifle at anybody unless you're willing to pull the trigger. No empty threats." So I told that story to President Reagan. And I said, as we conduct our foreign policy, we should be very careful with what we say. We should mean what we say. If we're going to say something is unacceptable, that means we're not going to accept it. And if it happens, if something's going to be done about it. If you're not going to do anything, don't say it in the first place. So if you get that reputation, when you say something, people will pay attention. But if you get the reputation of just being careless with words, they won't pay attention. So that was a pretty good lesson. And then, of course, I always remember I had in my group a wonderful sergeant that I relied on. I was a second lieutenant. His name was Patton. He was a great guy and very competent. And we had some action going on. And I was looking around for him, and I couldn't find him. I ran over to where I thought he might be, and I said, "Where the hell is Patton?" "Patton's dead, sir." I remember that to this day. He was killed. And so the reality of war sinks in. People get killed. People get injured. People get traumatized. So if you are in a position of authority and you're deciding whether to send people to war or whatever, be sure the mission is a real good mission. And be sure that you put our people in a position that they can achieve it. Because people are going to pay a price. And it has to be a really important mission before you're going to send people in to pay that price. So that was the worst day of the Reagan administration is when the Marine barracks in Beirut were bombed. They were there in a peacekeeping mission. That was not a classic use of force. So we were strong, but we were very careful. President Eisenhower boasted when he left office, General Eisenhower, said, "During my 8 years as president, not one soldier, not 1 inch of ground was lost." It's a man who understood war. It's not a bad thing if you have in the top end of government people who had the experience of war. And it's not an abstraction, it's a human reality. So I learned these things as a Marine.
Secretary Shultz, my name's Nicole. I was wondering...
How come how many more questions are there anyway?
Well, let's see.
Go
I
ahead.
think
No, I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
I was wondering if there's any particular triumph or incident that stands out as most prominent in your career?
Well, the things that you somehow get the most satisfaction from, for me, always have a human face. And I've told many times about worrying about people in the Soviet Union who were denied the right to emigrate, denied the right to worship. And we worked hard on that subject. And there was a woman named Nita Nudell, whose case I worked on. And I would call on her when I was in Moscow. But you feel there's sort of futility, because in the end, there's not really much you can do except at least let them know that somebody out there understands their problem. And I had put her name on a list I'd given to Shevardnadze once to do something about it. I'm sitting in my office in the State Department, and I get told there's a phone call coming, so I pick up the phone. On the other end of the phone, this little boy says, "This is Ida Nudell. I'm in Jerusalem." So some human being was a little better off, and I had something to do with it. So that kind of thing makes you feel that it's worth it. There are all these abstractions like we ended the Cold War and stuff like that. Well, it's a big deal, but somehow it's an abstraction. And human things are the ones that you sort of feel have a reality to them.
Secretary Shultz, I'm Sonic Malaka, and I was wondering, what advice do you have for us in our preparation as future citizens of this country? Of this country.
Citizens of the country, what advice do I have? Well, I have a tie that I wear occasionally, particularly in political events, that Ronald Reagan gave me early in the primary season back in 1980 or so. And on the tie it says, "Democracy is not a spectator sport." So you got to take part. That doesn't necessarily mean serve or run for office, but pay attention, take part in the political process. Figure out who you might be for, and then ask them questions. Be sure that they have a view. So I think that the basic advice for a citizen in our country is to be alert to what's going on and pay attention and be part of it. And don't think only in terms of national issues. Mostly my political career has been engaged with national issues, but here I am, and my wife has been chief of protocol in the city of San Francisco for 8 mayors now. So all of a sudden I've been learning. We both lost our earlier spouses to cancer, and we got married about 14 years ago. So I've been learning about San Francisco as a city and its government. And after all, it's in cities that the acts of government are closest to you. They're the ones that do the police force and the fire and the schools and the things that are very much a part of your everyday life. So my basic advice is, take the advice on that tie. Democracy is not a spectator sport.